Go ahead and get us started. I know some people are out in the hall, and they're going to probably start trickling back in once we start doing something interesting. All right, so welcome to the second panel of Data Innovation Day. This panel is on the future of data-driven clinical trials. We have a great set of panelists here today. Starting on my left, Nate Kreisel, who's the Vice President of Real-World Informatics and Analytics at Astellas Pharmaceuticals. Going down, Faisal Khan, who's the Executive Director of Advanced Analytics and Artificial Intelligence at AstraZeneca. Gil Alterovitz, did I get that? I still said it wrong. Did I get Alterovitz? Yes. Who's a Presidential Innovation Fellow here in DC. And finally, at the end, Ken Bingson, who's Director of eSource at Pfizer. So thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really excited to kind of kick off this conversation because, first of all, obviously, three of you are from pharmaceutical companies, and I really want us to do a deep dive on some of the really interesting opportunities that you're seeing in this space. And then Gil, I think, has been really looking at this from the government side and some interesting connections about how government can bring insights into how some of this works. So let's just jump right in. I just want to do kind of a level-setting question. And maybe, Nate, we'll start with you, and anyone else that wants to jump in on this, please feel free. Just as a kind of starting at the basics, how are we seeing AI make it easier, faster, and cheaper to test new drugs? Where are the changes coming in this space?
Yeah, so I'll preface my comments with the fact that these are kind of my own personal comments and the standard disclaimer, not the position for Astellas, even though I work there currently. So I think where we've seen, at least my group or my experience, where I've seen AI play a significant role is actually pretty early on in the process and helping us understand, kind of pursuant to the last panel of the data, what's the current state of the disease. We're looking at patient segmentation, biomarkers and the like, and so kind of sifting through huge amounts of data, understanding kind of who could benefit the most, what some of the underlying causality is of a potential disease, and then lining that up with therapy. So that kind of the translational medicine space, I think we're seeing a lot of kind of progress for advanced analytics and AI in that space. So that's kind of one key area we're seeing. But again, just kind of sifting through kind of larger and larger data sets, more diverse data sets to find that signal in the noise.
Thanks.
So I'll jump in and echo your disclaimer with ditto, but substitute AstraZeneca in for Astellas. So I think you're seeing a lot of opportunities leveraging advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data science, whatever you want to call it, but newer ways of looking at data to drive operational efficiencies and execution in clinical trials. Some of them are purely from an operational, perhaps budgetary perspective. You might be thinking about things like site selection and better ways for patient recruitment modeling. So sometimes it costs a lot of money to get a site up and running for a clinical trial, and if that site doesn't enroll any patients or barely enough patients to make that worthwhile, that has significant budgetary impacts. So those are the types of things that analytics and better integrated use of data can help lead to better decision making from a business perspective. Then there's other areas where you're combining more of a...
Oh, you just tilted, yeah.
All right, is that better? Excellent. Wave your hands next time. I'll catch it better. And then there's other areas where you're combining more scientific interests that are going to lead to operational efficiencies as well. Integration of wearable devices where you're getting some really interesting measurements, and it leads to the ability to recruit patients faster in a broader suite of patients that perhaps don't have to come into a medical facility as often. So you're saving execution costs there, but you're still getting signal. Has challenges then in terms of the instability of that signal, but those are the types of things that you can start to leverage to both realize scientific value in a clinical trial as well as realize operational efficiencies.
All right. Yeah, thanks for having us here. So I wanted to tell you guys a little bit about, kind of start with a quick story about if you have, let's say, your iPhone, right, and it runs out of battery, what do? You're looking for the outlet, you're looking for your emergency battery. If you're sleeping and it, rings or there's an alert, it's capturing your attention, right? And so sometimes there's almost a question of who is controlling who, the machine or the person for that. And I think what we're going to start to see is a little more of what I call a symbiotic AI relationship. So symbiotic AI, where you have the AI kind of helping guide the clinical trial design process, the recruiting process, the communicating of information about the process, and then the results and translating that into meaning. And so it won't be like it is now where humans are kind of directing everything, but AI will be at first a guider and then eventually even more of a symbiotic relationship where the AI will make certain suggestions, people may or may not adopt it, and then that makes it easier for the AI to do the next step and so forth. So I think that's one of the big changes that we'll see coming, symbiotic AI.
Thanks.
Great. First of all, it's a great crowd considering that we're thinking there may have been a hurricane this week, so I wasn't quite sure how this would look. But I'm just going to maybe just give a couple use cases of what we're doing and what we're doing in this space, and then where we see, especially I guess where I'm specifically working, where we see opportunities for AI. So we're right now so we kind of bucket it together. You said natural language processing, there's robotics, there's AI, there's I think a few different splinters of the word. So like on the robotics piece, we're currently looking at just repeatable pieces that human beings are currently done. So there's running a report that we spend 10,000 hours a year on. We have now moved that over to robotics. So that's freeing up people's time. It's making it more efficient. It's having that cadence of having data. And we're looking more into doing those types of things. What are we doing now that we could look to utilize robotics to help facilitate, take some of these day-to-day mundane pieces away from people. And then just kind of tie it into the discussion before about interoperability, because that's really, to me, a key to a lot of what we're doing, and especially my space in the clinical trial space is, having access to broad data, whether it be wearables, whether, and I'm going to talk specifically about electronic health records, at the sites themselves, about, the data that's collected in these electronic health records. So I think people probably currently, if you're aware in the clinical trial space, data is essentially double data entered into one system and it's entered into sponsor systems. So there's a lot of redundancies, and there's quality issues and there's time issues. So the industry, the FDA has provided great guidance on how to go and get data from electronic health records. So we could replace the piece where we're having manual entry. This is faster, it's better quality. I mean, this is getting drugs to market faster, which we want for the patient experience. But there's the current limitations we're seeing is that the EHR vendors are set up specifically at sites, and the data they collect in the structured data is pretty limited. I mean, there's data that's very structured. Your demography, your vital signs, laboratory. It's very easy to get that data. But when we talk about interoperability, we want all data. There's currently a gap with a lot of unstructured data. So these are physician notes and could contain adverse events or medications are being taken. So that's one area I think we're looking at AI, because right now to get that data, you have to have people manually sift through this to decide, is this relevant clinical information? Does it go in? Is it part of the clinical trial? But with the where we're seeing AI and maybe natural language processing really coming into this is the AI, the ability to go through this data, sift through it, and provide and normalize that data for to have a whole comprehensive picture of that clinical trial data.
Mm-hmm.
You made one comment about the regulatory aspect of things, and I think that's interesting because to a certain extent, areas where there's more of a regulatory focus, there's a certain inertia towards applying AI because there's a lot that people have to keep in mind. Whereas in other areas where there isn't a regulatory oversight, you see things moving much faster. And you have some innovative concepts that are maybe just on the edges waiting to come in, things like perhaps virtual clinical trials or synthetic control arms and things like that, where you have AI people thinking about problems that perhaps the world isn't really ready to just act on their full implications, but that's what makes it exciting.
Good point.
I want to ask if we can dig into two particular functions, patient matching and enrollment, where it seems like AI is kind of opening up new opportunities. And just kind of with that, I mean, those are different functions, but it seems like this is, when you talk about kind of the robotics, this is an area it's a human labor challenge right now. And whenever you have human labor, that's cost. Can anyone on this panel talk about where you're seeing that opportunity and if you're seeing early successes in using AI to help with that? Go.
I could take that on from some work that we've been, as a fellow, working with the National Cancer Institute and a couple of other institutions as well, is there's several areas where AI can contribute. One, if you're looking at recruiting, and that is basically matching or searching for trials for patients, that's kind of the reverse problem of trying to get a patient into a trial. What you see is that there's, again, this issue with a lot of text, unstructured data. You've got the eligibility criteria that is text written as prose, and different people write in different ways. And then on the other side, in the medical record or wherever the patient information is that's collected or given on the phone when they're looking for a trial, that information may not be in a structured way using ontologies and so forth. And so kind of finding that world of mapping from one world, if you make an ontology here, making sure it can map here, it's sort of an interoperability problem in a way. But using AI to try to use natural language processing to turn these text into these ontologies is one thing that needs to be done. But another is to just recognize that some of these are very complicated phrasings that are not necessarily always needed. They mean many times the same thing, but it kind of confuses the AI. And that kind of got back to that symbiotic AI that I was saying. So the approach we're taking now is like there's going to be there's an editor where someone can actually have their protocol and suggestions are made by the AI on what happened in the past for protocols in terms of criteria. And then it'll make a suggestion, and people can accept or not accept that suggestion. But over time, that will gradually get them toward the more standardized phrasings, which is easier for AI to use itself for learning. So AI essentially is slowly kind of bringing the people toward a standard so that the AI itself can use it. That was kind of like the analogy I gave with the phone, where the phone will cry out for help that it needs it to be charged, and then that gets you to charge it, and then you can use your phone for what you want, and the phone can do what it needs to do. So that's another area, and then a final area is conversational AI. So having different agents and avatars interact with the patients to tell them information about clinical trials, where to go, and help them in the matching process. So those are some of the examples where we've seen kind of AI in the clinical trial recruitment space at this point.
We've seen a couple of, at least in my experience, I've seen a couple of different uses here, maybe not quite that sophisticated. I think one is just in simulation for clinical trial design. And so we look at inclusion exclusion criteria parameters and then look and see if there's something that's especially problematic through those simulations and say, well, if we were to change, still within the good confines of clinical science, but and the the translational science that we have, but just looking at relaxing certain criteria for the enrollment can actually speed things up, and that's just a very basic use of kind of simulation and modeling for those things. And then the other area that in some of my experience has been in predicting and kind of predictive diagnoses. So you have kind of some of the, especially maybe the rare disease space, or things that maybe physicians are not used to seeing as much, and you actually have some flags for patients pre-diagnosis of a condition that may be difficult or a catch-all, and say, hey, did you realize, doctor, this patient might be a candidate for this type of clinical trial? They might have this type of diagnosis. So we've seen those types of use cases as well.
It's an area that's really ripe for advanced intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, to data science to find some applications. At the end of the day, for any sponsor or CRO, running a clinical trial is a key bread and butter business process. And it's highly inefficient because it's very expert and human-driven. There's a lot of heuristics and people who've made their careers. They grew up as a CRA and got into clinical trial operations, and that's what they do. But you end up in a situation perhaps where there's a lot of judgment and biases, and people are not able to take into account the world of data out there and mine it and analyze it effectively to suggest opportunities where, for example, someone says, I know that site is good. The doctor there is really good. True. But they also have 5 other trials running there. So for your indication, maybe if you had gotten there 2 years ago, you could have enrolled better now. But now you have to be aware of what else is out there. Other types of operational challenges come up in terms of geographic distributions. And as we start to mine data and analyze opportunities, the challenge really comes up in putting this into production. There's a sense of resistance because people have done things a certain way. But any AI application, at least in its infancy, also has some challenges. So people raise objections like, oh, your fancy black box algorithm didn't think about such and such criteria, these constraints, or this situation in that country, or we have to include this site for whatever reason. So you have to kind of separate out some of the algorithmic issues from the business and data issues, and that can be a complicated undertaking. One area where there's a lot of promises, for example, mining EMRs, EHRs to identify patients. Great within the US, lots of integrated solutions, data vendors that you can access to find that. More difficult outside the US, particularly if you get into Asia, et cetera. So there's very few sponsors, particularly at a large scale, who are going to run all their trials only in the US. So how do you come up with challenges where you can develop a more systematic protocol or process? Because if you go to any clinical operations group within a pharma company and say, for the US, do things this way, and for the rest of the world, do things this way, you've just pretty much doubled their burden and administrative overhead. So you've got to kind of think through some of those challenges in real-world deployment of AI applications.
Gil, you had something?
Yeah, I was just going to add a kind of follow-up point to that in terms of data innovation, one of the things that we're looking at to try to address some of those is by actually releasing some de-identified data, which was done for a couple hackathons just a couple days ago, both de-identified patient participant information people are calling in for clinical trials, as well as eligibility criteria that is structured. So it was done manually, so it can serve as a training basis for AI. And then we're about to start basically for 3 months to engage a number of different technology companies around that data to see how can they build tools around that. Because one of the things we found, which I think was alluding to, is that a lot of tools will say, oh, they're so great, you know, they're getting everything perfect, 99% accuracy. That sounds great but they're using different parameters, different types of data sets. So the goal here is have this one standard data set that's released. Everyone performs on that data set, and if there's any additional data that's withheld as a test set, that can also be done. So you can get kind of compare an apple to an apple. That's kind of the thinking in this approach. So an iterative data release, get feedback on the data as well, get feedback on the tool's accuracy metrics.
I wanted to ask if you can comment on, kind of bringing it back to the patient experience. Obviously, a lot of these advancements are about creating efficiencies on the business side or on the operational side. But what's the impact on the patient? Because that ultimately is something I know every business is concerned about. Maybe Nate.
Yeah, I'll take maybe veer off the path of artificial intelligence here, maybe talk about other types of technologies, maybe specifically on remote patient monitoring and maybe some of the data streams that were mentioned earlier in kind of wearables. So I think it's with the patient experience that we should be seeing in that on those fronts is more streamlined types of clinical trials. So maybe fewer visits. They could be monitored at their own home. Maybe they could use their mobile device to enter in data versus using kind of paper diaries and those types of things. So I think you probably should see a much more efficient, less onerous participation in these clinical studies. I think also you'll see some better ways to interact with kind of study coordinators or site coordinators or site administrators or investigators. Where if they have a question or there's additional pieces that they want to provide, maybe a better patient experience on that to answering the questions or concerns they might have as they enter into a clinical trial. So people are not professional clinical trial participants, right? That's probably the first and only one that they'll be in, hopefully. So I think it's laying some of those fears and improving the interactions with the health systems. I think is another way that they can improve the patient experience through advanced technologies.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and agree with all those points. And I think one thing that to look at is to make clinical trials more patient-centric. So the patient is the controller of their data. So again, interoperability, that they own data. Data we collect goes to the patient. Patients can decide what they want to do with that data. Does it go back to primary care physicians? Does it go to their EHRs, et cetera? So we're talking about the concept of like location flexible studies, which really enhance the patient experience. So first of all, from the patient side, when you're on a trial, using technology to explain to them what, with different modalities of, videos or concierges, what do you expect to do on this trial? How is your experience going to be? How is the trial going? And, providing data during the conduct of the trial itself. So, how is recruitment going for the site? How long is the trial going to be? At the end of the trial, returning the data. But then I think the concept of like location flexibles, we've experimented with remote trials before, which is a centralized investigator with all assessments being done at a patient's house, or they're going to central labs to get that work done. But I think the location flexible idea is that maybe that works for some patients, or it works for patient population that aren't near investigators, but maybe not everybody wants someone to come in their house. Maybe they've got a large family. Maybe they don't want people in their house. So having flexible trials where you can have one trial with you have patients at home getting visits. Some that want that patient or that doctor experience can still have that. Supplementing that with trying to get more data electronically. So you're using mobile, you're using other techniques to limit the amount of office visits, but really putting the patient and that experience as front and center around that clinical trial.
I'd like to add that, echoing your comments, that the patient experience has to be at the center. I'd like to share two kind of stories that could drive some innovations, and with the disclaimer that these were not trials that my current employer ran. But in one scenario, there was a protocol where in one arm, the patients had received some kind of a shot or an injection of some kind, and immediately in the next 5 minutes, they had to have a blood pressure test, and for whatever reason, the protocol said do it on that same arm. There was no reason medically to do it, just that's the way the protocol was written, maybe because someone copied and pasted passages, right? So think about the burden on that patient, where you could just as easily have had the protocol say measure the blood pressure on the other arm, and that could have been significantly easier for the patient. There was another trial I've heard of where patients had to get take different urine measurements for various reasons, but it led to very awkward situations where patients were carrying this red urine jug around with them on the subway on their way to work. Can you imagine the kind of experience and suboptimal impressions people have of clinical trials with experiences like that? Or when clinical trials tell a medical clinic that you have to take a reading every 12 hours, and they're only open for 6 to 8 hours in a day. So there's a lot of intelligence in the human that AI techniques could encapsulate into just even reviewing and commenting on trial protocols. There's a lot of institutional knowledge, but it's sometimes not carried over, and finding ways to encode that and develop ways that you can either check or even generate trial protocols could be very beneficial to the patient experience.
Yeah. And let me ask a question. Actually, why don't you just go first, and then I'll...
Okay. All right. So I was just going to say that I think we're going to start to see kind of maybe a bimodal kind of distribution in terms of how the patient is at the center. I think in the last few years we've started to see a lot of things around N=1 trials, N of 1 trials, where you're kind of using the patient as their own control in some sense, and this is sometimes done for like rare diseases and other things. But with time, as we start to have more measurements, more genomics, there'll be more unusual cases like that. And those are examples where it's really hard to recruit many patients. And so they'll kind of be at the more kind of well-treated and kind of an exclusive sort of clinical trial. And then on the other side of the curve, there's going to be probably more of these large but more economic studies that where everyone's going through and they're in the first round, and they're looking kind of more general kind of approaches. But maybe the patient, it could use a little bit more of a patient interaction, and maybe AI can help in that. But I think there's this dichotomy that we may end up seeing in the next few years based on that trend.
Yeah, I want to dig into it was brought up now a couple of times, the idea that, now there's wearables, now there's mobile devices, and, all of these, connected devices are creating new sources of patient data. So how are we seeing that integrated into the clinical trials? How is it affecting the design of these trials? And what does that mean for basically the speed at which this can be done, the efficiency at which these can be done?
I'll take a stab at that. So I think one of the ways you see it incorporated is, at least initially, is as kind of secondary endpoints, right, that you want to capture in clinical study. And say that, I think that's just kind of where we are in the kind of in the state of the art and incorporating these things into maybe a very kind of traditional type of approach for clinical study. I think where we're going, into the future is having these be more kind of seamless and objective endpoints, right? That you can again tie back into a kind of a meaningful clinical measure, right? So you've got kind of real-time streaming. We talked about some of that previously. So how do you make sense of this data? How do you tie that back to a different type of clinical measure? So if you see a motion sensor, how do you know if somebody had nocturia, right? They had to get up in the middle of the night and use the restroom or something like that. So I think you'll see these, but they'll be more seamlessly integrated, more objective type of measures than somebody kind of recording what their experience was, or how many episodes of this did they have in a paper diary, where they're just relying on their own kind of memory or recall to do that. I think you'll also have instances where you'll capture more kind of asymptomatic information, where a patient might not even know what they're experiencing. I mean, the easiest one is like a blood pressure or something, where you wouldn't get maybe just periodic types of signals, but you would maybe have a more continuous signal. So I think that can improve the quality of the data, the granularity of the data you're getting. But then also go back to the patient experience, where you don't have to go to site visits. You don't have to worry about logging in your kind of your records. It's just automatically captured and uploaded for you as a participant in the clinical trial.
Yeah, maybe I can jump to Ken real quick, and then I'll come back. Ken, you think about electronic health records and how all this is integrated, and even a lot of the EHR vendors are still figuring out how to integrate this data. Are they getting into clinical trials? Is the non-traditional, even more non-traditional data sets like the consumer genomics testing, is that getting in? How are they dealing with these challenges?
Yeah, so it's a really, really good question. So we've done quite a bit of work of going to individual hospitals, usually larger hospitals, to see what's their interest in seeing this shift to from the way they traditionally run clinical trials to get into their systems. And right, there's no technical constraints on this. A lot of it is we're learning as we're going, is that some hospitals have very large IT staffs that support this. Other ones are a little bit more apprehensive. So I think it's early on in the game. I think, and also their priorities of what they're all already working on at the sites. So we're getting a cross breadth of what different hospitals will do or are kind of coming along. I mean, the industry seems to be changing a lot, where there's a lot more new players involved, with very large name technology companies getting involved with interoperability with Verily and Google and Apple Health Toolkit and FHIR data standards. So the industry seems to be moving that way, but I mean there is a resistance that's not insurmountable, but there is a resistance to change right now that we're seeing. Did I answer your question, or was there another part to that as well?
Yeah, I mean that's getting there. I mean, look, at the airport this week, I lost the charger to my phone, and I mean, it's a new phone. I went to 3 stores, I couldn't find a charger for USB-C. I mean, that's an interoperability problem, right? In the data space, interoperability is so much harder, and Apple released new flagship devices yesterday. So the pace of change that we see in these connected devices is so rapid. At the same time, we're not even caught up now with integrating interoperability.
Yep.
So I guess my question is, are we always going to be doing catch-up? Is there a way to kind of get ahead of the curve so we're not consistently struggling with how do we integrate the newest devices? Is there a way that we can kind of build this as part of the development life cycle so it comes in already integrated?
Yeah, I mean, there's some industry standards, specifically in the United States, like HL7 and FHIR standard, which is a standard to transfer data interoperability. Mm-hmm. It's an industry solution, but it's very naive right now. So, it's still being worked through. It's not collecting all the data that you need. All the data sets are there. So right now, it's a very non-very technical way of transferring data. It seems like the industry's getting there, but right now the solutions that are in place are not scalable for the amount of data we need to run clinical trials. But there's a lot of vision on this and what it will be but it's not there yet.
Yeah.
Some of the challenges in clinical trials also have to do with wearable devices, have to do with regulatory concerns. So if you think about the fact that, okay, I just have to run during a particular trial, even there, you'd spend a lot of work trying to get a particular wearable device to work out. There are questions that regulators ask about the signal you measured from that, even though it has a lot of operational benefits, patient experience, reducing cohort sizes, et cetera. But that's one of the reasons why they're mostly in the secondary endpoints right now, because no one wants to take that risk with their primary endpoint. Now, there's cases where you could really see, in an ideal world, a use for a wearable device. I once worked on a project where for Parkinson's disease, the drug is really difficult to administer the right dose. And physicians rely on patients keeping very inaccurate diaries. So if you think about someone suffering from Parkinson's disease, they have difficulty writing anyway if they're in very advanced stages of the disease. But you have to remember that today this is subjectively how severe my symptoms were, and this is the dose I took. And then wait until your appointment with your physician, maybe in 3 weeks, and then they'll readjust. So wearable could provide real-time information, and your physician could adjust your dose real time. You could go to the pharmacy the next day and pick up the right dose for you, depending on what they're seeing. Now you're even beyond the context of a single trial. You've got a wearable or a device in the treatment path. And that leads to a significant regulatory hurdle. And let's say you invest all that time to figure that out. So either you have a proprietary wearable device, which is very expensive, or you did all your work with a certain Android or Apple phone, and you did spend a year and a half doing this, and guess what? That's no longer in the market. So those are some of the challenges that real-world market considerations as well as regulatory considerations you have to keep in mind during a clinical trial specifically.
Can I ask you to quickly expand on one point? At the very beginning, you mentioned how one of the positive benefits could be reducing cohort size. Can you expand on that, how that actually happens?
Well, there's a few different ways, right? One, there's a lot of dropout during the course of a clinical trial to get to sometimes a significant enough population. It's hard to go to a physician, life gets in the way, et cetera. If you're tracking signal at the patient's home, and if it's in a well-structured study, you can reduce dropout, and then you reduce the necessary cohort size that you need to enroll a population. That's one example.
Yeah. And so how much of an impact on cost is that likely to have in that phase?
Depends on the therapeutic area and the size of the trial. Could potentially be very, very significant.
Yeah. Yes, Gil.
Yeah, I just want to add two trends that I think are going to change the field a little bit here. So the source data being right now a lot of times electronic medical record notes and things like that. We see that sort of as highly prized, especially the structured data in the electronic medical record. But what we see is, as kind of was mentioned, there's going to be a lot more of these wearable, non-traditional sources, and they're growing exponentially. They're growing at a rate that they, in a relatively short time, over a few years, they will be much bigger, much bigger than the amount of data that's in the electronic medical record. So then we have just really two questions. Do we trust that data or not? And so what I've seen is that many of the very new devices, I see them being tried in other countries where there's a different regulatory environment. They get approved there, and then they kind of get back here. So I'm seeing that a lot of companies are trying to get things approved at medical grade. Once that happens and they can show that there's no essential difference, significant difference between that and the other larger device, then that data may be used. Now, if it's not put in the EMR because the EMR doesn't have a source, there are a number of companies now that are looking at doing cloud-based environment, and so what we think about as the EMR today may not be what we think about as the EHR tomorrow, the whole health record, because there'll be a combination of many records of which the medical record, as we see it today, may be maybe a minor part even, but it will be a part. But I think there's going to be a whole infrastructure of what will be the core and what will people see and what will people use based on quality. But once these wearables are established to be of quality and people will see how much more data there is, it's going to be a vital link that I think people will start to take more seriously.
I think one of the other pieces of that too has to be, you get a huge signal, but I think you also have to understand, there's a quality element of it too, but there's also an interpretability, right? So like, how do you interpret the signal? Does that mean I have, is the drug working for my Parkinson's disease? So what does that signal look like, right? I mean, if just you get my Fitbit data, does that, what does that say about me? And I think there's a lot of, I think, not just, kind of quality of the data validation work you have to do, but it's like also tying that to what's a real clinical outcome or a clinical endpoint, right? That means, and just, does that mean I have, back spasms? Does that mean that I have, early stage, whatever, cachexia or whatever it might be, right? I mean, like what signal of that wearable, kind of translates or is interpreted to mean, kind of a medical condition or clinical condition that somebody could treat or you could act upon. I think that's just a huge, right?
Yeah, I just
corpus
wanna,
of knowledge.
Yeah, that I think the low-hanging fruit will be first, where it's like a very small device that can be shown to be equivalent in the types of measurements it's taking, like it's EKG or things like that we already know how to interpret,
yeah.
and it has the complex that it makes will be can be shown to be equivalent. Then beyond that, it's like new types of data, right? That's another question, right? Like the Fitbit, others that give new types of data where it's questionable what is the correlation with what, right? That's the next step, and then is that actionable information too?
And the other challenge related to that is adherence. If you're relying on a wearable, then patients actually have to use the wearable and use it in the correct way, which is not always the case.
I want to ask about the diverse populations and ensuring that one of the issues that the center's written about for a while is a concept that we've called data poverty, where there are certain populations that for various reasons don't have data being collected about them or generated by them, and that will put them at a disadvantage in a more data-intensive world. And this is an issue that policymakers should think about, just like we think about the digital divide. It's not to say we don't want technology, but we should say, how do we make sure everyone's included? And I think this is especially true when we're talking about rare diseases, but we just know in general, different demographics have different diseases sometimes, different health conditions. And as we move into wearables, especially from consumer devices that might be generating some of this data, there might be groups left off. How are companies, how are researchers thinking about these challenges of ensuring that they basically have data, good coverage of data from all populations that they want to study, whether it's from consumer devices or even with electronic health records?
What? No, go ahead.
Okay. So I was just going to talk about that some of the dangers first, which is that sometimes now we see clinical trials happening in other countries where it may be cheaper, but the genetic variability may be different than in our country, or maybe kind of the environmental factors around that may be different. They may also influence the results. And so that is an issue that people are looking at. Another area that I've seen is like sometimes when you have data, you need to kind of make some synthetic data around it to be able to leverage a small data set. And so there's been uses of AI to make sure that there's unbiased synthetic data generation from a small sample set. So and to see if that set is biased or not. So by comparing it to another larger data set. So there's a few approaches that people are thinking of, and then there are a few challenges to be worried about that I wanted to know.
Well, I would say it raises a lot of significant ethical questions in some areas. I mean, if you're thinking about mining EHR, EMR types of records, there's a correlation between, for example, geographic zip code levels, socioeconomic status, and the healthcare facilities there having integrated systems and ability to mine them, et cetera, et cetera. If you're talking more about clinical trials and working through wearable devices, I think where you're seeing more there is a movement towards sponsors providing that device for patients. So if they've made sure that they've got a demographically diverse set of patients enrolling in their trial, most sponsors are then motivated to provide that device because it's critical to the execution of the trial. So I think in that setting, it's not as significant of an issue, barring the other larger issues. But then there's other applications of AI where you see opportunities in medicine and perhaps even treatment. I'll give an example of Watson, for example, where you see connections that are applied in various other geographic areas where perhaps those treatments are not available or those best practices that are not in place. So there's a divide even between technology and the real world that you really have to bridge and think carefully about, because at the end of the day, I would submit that the ethical considerations here are quite significant, and sometimes we don't pause to think through them.
I just have something to add too.
Sure.
And for part of your question, I'm going to answer. Another one is interesting. I never thought about it before. But the first part, I guess, is, we talk about running a trial and ensuring that those populations can utilize the technology, or that they can run, use, be of value on the trial. I guess I would just kind of revert back to, maybe that's where those patient flexible trials come about, that certain populations are using wearables and the best they can. And if a patient is a demographic or someone who's not comfortable, doesn't have the technology, that maybe that's more that the traditional methodology, maybe some blending of that to, to count for that, and not just have one way or another to collect data. Maybe you need different methodologies based on those demographics. And then your EHR question, that was interesting to me. That's a very good question. If we have populations that aren't in EHR, a lot of what we're talking about is registries and having access to data. So that's a lot where that is sourced from. So it's a good question.
So maybe kind of fill in some of the gaps in here. Maybe less technology oriented, but I think from a research perspective and from a just a good clinical practice and kind of bridging from randomized clinical trial, like very well controlled, safety and efficacy, to kind of real world, effectiveness and cost effectiveness. And ideally what you have is a population that you're studying in these well controlled trials, right, that looks like the population in which you're going to launch the drug, right? So we've got that real world setting, kind of just the normal course of clinical practice, right? Because that's how a therapy is going to be used eventually. And so, what are the ways that you can look to bridge those two worlds, right? So you start thinking about ways you can access and do pragmatic trials. I think it's even maybe not such a new buzzword, but still a kind of buzzwordy type of thing. So it's like, so what's the role of technology and EMR and data capture that way to start to move out of the maybe very few very well-controlled sites into more kind of that pragmatic setting where it does have more of a diversity of the population that you're studying. It doesn't answer the kind of the wearable piece and kind of the access to technology that way. But I think like the goal of a lot of companies, and I think everybody in the future, and I think also in FDA and the regulators, is to how do you start to take your gold standard of safety and efficacy and blend that into, kind of practically speaking, the effectiveness and real world effectiveness of your product.
And Gil had mentioned this, and I want to just circle back to the point about, the fact that, I think it's more than half of clinical trials are done overseas. Is that is that an active policy goal to bring more trials back to the United States, or is this just a reality that we say, well, it's cheaper to do it overseas, and we're trying to lower costs, and we're trying to strike the right balance?
I think the policy goal is in the opposite direction. Many international regulators require that you have participants from their geographic location. So if your trial is only run in the US, good luck getting it approved in Japan. So there's actually, I would say from a policy perspective, the push is in the other direction.
Just whose policy?
Fair enough. So I want to get to another question. This issue actually came up on the previous session, where the point was raised that data sharing between companies is so helpful, and we're seeing more and more of it. Particularly in the last few years, traditional competitors are now sharing their data, and whether it's from clinical trials or from even earlier stage research. Since we have three people from industry in this space, I just wanted you to talk about that point in terms of how you're seeing industry change in this regard. What are the motivations in this space, and what impact has it had as there is more data sharing and kind of, I think, a recognition that everyone's better off with more access to data because you're still going to innovate in ways that are very competitive.
Sure. Go ahead. I can start with this one. And I trying to figure out a use case of what maybe this is derived from. So, there's a consortium of pharmaceutical and biotech companies called Traceability, and this is trying to find industry solutions for non-proprietary or where you're not gaining, it's achieving common goals. So there's examples of taking training that the investigators may have to do for every sponsor on a system, and let's leverage that and just train once and make an investigator job easier. There's one on eSource, but there was one around data sharing, and the idea of this was, let's take our placebo arms of data and share those with these other companies. We've seen that patients, one of the drawbacks of going into a clinical trial is they don't like the idea of a placebo arm, that they may be on treatment and they might not be getting a drug. They're getting placebo. So the thought is, of taking this data that other companies have run, and if you're going to run a trial, can we use that data as a placebo arm? Was that conditions in the protocol written in a way that we could supplement a trial and not run a placebo or a portion of a placebo arm, and that could be used in a submission. I don't know if it's been done yet. I think there's some probably regulatory buy-in and pieces. At least I'm not aware of it being done. But I think those are the concepts and where I think the value comes in with sharing that type of clinical data.
To build on that, I think there's two major issues here. One is purpose. So everyone, for whatever reason, is deathly afraid of sharing their proprietary data because they don't want the other guy to get an advantage. So I'm not doing anything with my data, but if I share it and you use it to your benefit, then I enable that. So there's that fear. And even with initiatives like Traceability, et cetera, Traceability started out by sharing meta-level data about a trial, right? No one actually wanted to share the trial-level data. Now there's some conversations, like you're saying, about sharing the control or placebo arm, but no one is talking about sharing their actual interventional arm because that's their proprietary in-house IP, even if that drug died and they're never going to do anything with it. So I think there's those types of issues where you have to get buy-in. But then the other side of it is, let's say you have buy-in or some discussions. The world of data standards is the most non-standard thing around. You have 11 standards. People get together and say, okay, we're going to solve this problem. They spend 2 years on it, and now you have 12 standards. And rinse, recycle, repeat, right? So I think those are the types of issues that get in the way. And you really, at least on the data standard side, you really only see significant movement where there's a larger, perhaps, government or other type of body. And for example, regardless of data standards and whatever else has happened in the world, CDISC and SAS files submitted to the FDA are still the standard. Even though statisticians who are newly graduating from grad school are using R and Python, they learn SAS on the job so they can submit their files. So because of that overarching kind of mandate, you get to see standards that are then sticky. And so I think that speaks to where those standards have to come from.
Well, some of the changes in clinical design, when we're talking about these virtual clinical trials or the home-based clinical trials, will that help enable data sharing in the future because we're kind of pulling from the same data sets and maybe enforcing rigor and maybe how the data is collected, or does this challenge remain?
I think the challenge largely remains. I don't think it's necessarily a technical issue about sharing the data, or I think you can, when you share your data, you can agree on one of the 12 standards, and pool it and share it that way, whatever the consortia companies might be there. But I think it is more of a kind of on what elements are for-profit companies going to compete, right? Is it, I think I took a lot of time and money and energy and created a very interesting, kind of fully integrated at the patient level data set. And I have some signal in there from, a couple of experimental, therapies that were tried in that. And I can start to make some of those correlations. Like, yeah, I'm probably not going to share, much of that data set because it took me, 20 years to build. That's not going to be one of those things. But if it's a placebo arm of my last, 10 years of clinical study, there's a lot more kind of value in scaling that way. So I think it's more about, where are companies, are they seeing their competitive advantage, and less on any type of technical or standards, types of hurdles. I mean, you can get over those. It's just if there's value in it, I think it is just more about, hey, where are you trying to compete?
Yeah. I want to talk about some of the regulatory challenges there, kind of leading into our final panel of the day. Do you see regulatory challenges that hold back greater use of AI or even data collection in clinical trials?
I can go ahead if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, for me, looking at the clinical trial space, we're talking data lineage going through, from system to system, and that has been it's a very rigid, you have to have full validation, you have to show data traceability. So as we move to AI, which may learn and have that, I think the regulators just need to appreciate that and be on board while we're still protecting patient safety and that data lineage. We still want that there, but I think AI, especially around some of the regulated areas, we'll need to work on that. And then I think of these, so some countries are more advanced on what they're saying is allowed for devices or even EHR data. But if we're running global trials, and will our regulations be allowed to be in a submission in another country? And because they were very early on this, so that synergies between at least the primary regulators, that they, are they close enough, or are they, is there communication that the decisions that one is making would be acceptable for another, and that even maybe that they're even similar. That's a challenge I see in the regulatory environment in general.
I would add that those of us who are kind of on the pharmaceutical side, there is, and sometimes rightfully so, a notion that the regulators are very conservative and they won't accept anything new. But in forums like this, et cetera, when you talk with folks from a regulatory background or who are actively in the regulatory space, it's surprising. They're open to new ideas. It's not as if there's this reflex to say, no, just do things the way it's always been. They're always open to new ideas and new ways of doing things, but they, I think, and this is my personal opinion, rightfully so, do come with strings attached saying, try something new, but make sure it's standardized, make sure it's effective, it's not pushing patient and the larger patient populations at risk. And those are hurdles that are sometimes, for various reasons, harder to get through. So I definitely acknowledge that the regulatory considerations in this industry do serve to slow things down a little bit compared to, say, AI applications in social media or internet advertising, et cetera, et cetera. But there are considerations that, to a certain extent, are important and useful. But I think sometimes we tend to overthink and be afraid of that, and no one wants to take the risk, whereas the regulators are saying, come to us, talk to us, and let's see what can be done.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, so I found two kind of modes that I think I've seen that this happens. So one is you've got a new technology, and this happens all the time. So before I was doing things with genomics, and there's a rule that comes out, it doesn't mention genomics. So what do? Is genomics covered or not? So then you see, does it map to labs? Maybe genomics is kind of like a type of lab. And so then you try to map it into that. If you can map it into that previous world, maybe it's a paper-based world if you have a digital document, then that makes it a lot easier. To kind of define a process. Where it becomes harder is when you don't have that. So for example, in AI, sometimes you don't have, some of your best results are not explainable, and you don't have, but they're the best results, so you don't want to use maybe a worse result that is explainable. So what do you do in that submission? But changing processes, as was noted, can take time. So the easiest is if it can map. Otherwise, I think sometimes the issue is sort of uncertainty, and industry maybe also doesn't like uncertainty. What does this mean? It has a couple interpretations, different, for HIP or other things, different lawyers will have different interpretations of it. So when things are uncertain, there's no unified understanding of something for that new technology, then people are concerned about investing in that technology.
I just maybe build on that a little bit too. I think there is, from a regulatory standpoint, some of the AI models, they are a bit of a black box, right? And it's, they're not totally explainable. No offense, but and I think that's one of the issues, or maybe it's not as easily understandable as maybe some of your more traditional kind of biostatistics in the models and explaining the data that way. And I think that's probably where we have maybe the most to learn and the most experience to gain, and from the adoption of the regulators is how comfortable can we get with the black box approach? Like, well, that's what the data said. Like, this is the subpopulation that I actually want to launch into for an indication because that was the one that responded best out of my somewhat diverse clinical trial. I didn't have a pre-specified analysis for that. Is that okay? right? I mean, but it was, an unbiased AI that picked out this population of what are the salient features for this, for the, the population in which I want to get my indication and make a claim on that. I think we're a bit of a ways away from that type of an approval of a marketing authorization from a regulator. But I think that is part of the future. It's just kind of how do we get comfortable getting in that space.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I do think that's a really important point. I think you described well a future that we might want to get to, and where we are today. How does that change look? Is it evolutionary? Is it that we can make incremental progress to that state, or is it we kind of look and wait until we finally get to a current state and we make a big jump in terms of the process?
I think it is going to be incremental. I don't think maybe starting out, and I think we may have seen some examples of this in a I'm going to struggle to find the exact one, but I think we have seen some examples where you kind of actually mine through the data and you say, hey, like that's my signal, and then you actually have to go run a confirmatory trial on that. And I think we have enough of that experience. You start to people become more comfortable. Like I don't it doesn't make look at that space, but it doesn't make sense for me to run a trial in that population. And you might see some real world data that comes out there and says, well, people have been doing that and using the drug off label already in that space. They haven't had a bad outcome yet, and it looks like there is some efficacy there. And you might be able to get an approval based on that, right? And based on that body of evidence. And I think if you have, kind of enough of those types of examples, you probably could then start to convince regulators that that's a viable pathway forward. So I think it's going to be more incremental than it is, like revolutionary, like we have a validated AI that you can go out and pick the right patient population. I don't think it's going to be a step change. I think it's going to be very incremental on how we get there, in my opinion.
I think there's multiple issues that you touched on there, which is, first of all, regardless of an algorithmic or AI-based technique, it's sub-patient populations and investigations there, the multiple testing hypothesis, that I think those are types of the issues we got to work through in terms of data robustness and validity, regardless of AI. I mean, you could be doing logistic regression and you still have to deal with some of those issues. But then you remarked on something else, which is if you are using an AI technique, say maybe in the where you're seeing a lot of this at the forefront is in companion diagnostics in the oncology space, where you start to get into, okay, now you have an AI technique, how interpretable is it? Is it a neural network that's a black box, really hard to describe? Is it something more like a random forest or logistic regression, something that's easier to interpret? So I think there's a lot of commingled issues of conceptually how you've designed the study, the algorithms you're using, et cetera. And there's no one easy answer. You kind of have to address them individually, and then they kind of roll up to the big picture.
Great. Well, I want to open it up for questions. We have about 10 minutes. And obviously, we have some great experts on these issues. So if you raise your hand, we'll bring a mic out to you right here in the front, and then back here on this side.
I apologize if I'm repeating something. I had to leave the room for a few minutes to get on a phone call. I was at a meeting on blockchain technology yesterday, and there was a brief mention of its use in medical records. And I'm wondering if you have medical records on a blockchain, if you're able to use those in clinical trials, or if blockchain is being used in any way in clinical trials that is advantageous, or is it too difficult?
You can't have a tech conference without mentioning blockchain. So I really appreciate the question.
I purposefully thought and decided not to mention blockchain for that reason.
I can
Please.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a great question. I think when people think about medicine, AI, blockchain sort of always lands in there somewhere. And there's a work, MedRec, I think, that came out a while back, which basically used pointers to the it only saved the pointers to the records in the blockchain, which kind of helped with some of the security aspects, as opposed to putting the actual data on the blockchain. There was a company I was actually just reading about last night that came out with this blockchain approach where people can say who they want to share their data with. It gets put onto the blockchain, and then other people can use that, and it can be monetized for the patient who's sharing that data. So there's definitely a couple that are looking at that, but they're all very, very new, and I think each one it needs to be kind of investigated in terms of how scalable it is, and also honestly why they're using blockchain, because while blockchain certainly is one approach to doing it, unless you're trying to take advantage of certain of its features like the distributed ledger, some of the security features, and transparency features, you may just be able to do with a regular database or a distributed database. But it's certainly an area that a number of companies are going for. Yeah.
And we had a question right here.
Thank you. Nate, you touched on this a little bit around real-world evidence and the use of application against patient populations. Across the industry, are you seeing a heavy application of AI or other modalities against real-world evidence in patient populations? For example, pregnant women against a specific utilization of a product in a way that's real and usable from an outcome standpoint?
Where I've seen maybe the most use has been in maybe some like just unsupervised machine learning to kind of pick out some, so maybe the most meaningful patient segments. So like who are the bad actors in terms of like healthcare utilization, or who has maybe poorer outcomes. So kind of providing some more hypotheses from kind of hypotheses rather that you wouldn't have guessed at previously. So we've seen some of that type of thing. I'm struggling to figure out if there's maybe a specific population or how we're seeing that from an outcome standpoint. But I've seen it been used where you wanted to have your evidence generation strategy and say, well, which patient populations do you want to study? And it's maybe not just first line, second line, third line, or some like a line of therapy type of thing. But if you actually want to pull out and say like, who might our drug work better for, right? And are there some subpopulations we should be looking at? You can actually run some health economics or outcomes research types of studies like that. And I've seen, like an unsupervised machine learning algorithm kind of go through that in just a data exploration standpoint to say like, all right, hey, are there some areas we're missing? Are there some new areas that we should be looking at from a patient characteristic standpoint? So I don't know if that answers your question or not, or I just chose to answer whatever question I wanted. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Other questions? I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a blind spot I have in the back there. So if anyone does raise your hand back there, just signal and we'll make sure we get you. There's one right here though, for now.
Hi. Last month, the FDA announced a program for pilots for changes in complex designs, and particularly using an adaptive Bayesian approach. Are any of your firms participating in that, and what would you say about that from a patient perspective? If let's say you have a recurrence of cancer and your antigens are changing each time you go through recurrence, to have extended endpoints.
So I maybe answer part of that in terms of, I know I've some maybe direct experience with companies I've worked at recently, to remain nameless, with kind of Bayesian approaches to kind of clinical studies and adaptive trial designs. I've maybe been too far removed from that space to answer exactly how they're being used or kind of what the patient experience would be. But again, I think an adaptive trial is rather just a one size fits all. I think it should be actually a more effective trial, smaller, putting fewer people at in maybe a placebo arm or something like that, right? So it could be a more effective, more efficient trial to get to a marketing authorization to launch a product into. I think that'd be a good thing from a patient experience standpoint, but kind of a little bit outside my bailiwick.
I feel the same as him. I really don't feel comfortable with an answer on that one. Just I wasn't not sure of the regulation either, so apologies.
Other questions? We have one in the back.
Hi, my question's about this interoperability bugaboo that floats around. And it's an opinion question. My thinking is that some entity could establish what might be called a standard framework, knowing it wasn't complete, but giving users the opportunity to dynamically add to it as they encountered new clinical realities. You're talking about drug reactions, and tie those to particular patients and particular conditions and genetics and so forth. It sounds kind of, pretty complicated, but I wondered, do you have any reaction to approaching it like that?
So I guess if I'm following the question, the complexities around interoperability, I think that there are, and if I'm getting this wrong, just please let me know, that there are interoperability standards that are being developed to transfer data through some, the big one right now in the United States is called FHIR. It's FHIR. It's part of HL7, which is to essentially map every domain and the data in a structure that can be outputted from a system and ticketed from another. It's very early stages. It's not really fit for clinical purpose yet, but from an industry perspective, that seems to be the one that has the most traction, in which companies and even the EHR vendors are attempting to do. I don't know if that answered your question.
I'll kind of reiterate my opinion is I think there are standards out there which are fairly comprehensive, which can accommodate a variety of data sources. The challenges with standards are adoption at critical enough mass so that they are truly interoperable and standardized. And I think that's where things fall apart. You get a lot of people who theoretically think through a lot of issues and say, okay, I have the world's close to best standard. Just adoption is not driven. And that's where I think the ball's dropped. So rather than concentrating on how do we get standards that capture the range of data we have, rather than trying to get the best standard out there, I think the focus should more be on trying to drive adoption of the closest best standards.
Great. Well, with that, we're at time on this panel. Please join me in thanking them for being here today and answering our questions. We're going to transition.